The American Midwest, a vast expanse of farmland where the sky meets the earth in an unbroken line, a horizon that seems to stretch into infinity. It's a place of quiet communities, built on resilience and self-reliance, where life follows the deliberate rhythm of the seasons. Marshall, Minnesota, is one such town. A dot on the map, but a universe to the people who call it home. A place where the silence of the night is a comforting blanket, a promise of peace and predictability. But on May 14, 2008, that comforting silence was shattered, torn apart by a single desperate phone call. It was replaced by a question that would echo through the years, a question that began in darkness and ended in an abyss of the unknown. This is the story of Brandon Swanson, a young man who vanished into the heart of that Midwestern night, leaving behind nothing but his car, his voice on a 47-minute recording of a call, and a mystery that endures to this day. To understand the loss, you must first understand what was lost. Brandon Swanson was a young man standing firmly on the cusp of his future. At 19 years old, he had the quiet confidence of someone who knew where he was going. He had successfully completed his first year at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, a challenging program in wind energy technology. He wasn't just studying a subject. He was pursuing a passion. He was fascinated by the elegant science of wind turbines, those modern giants that spin with hypnotic grace against the vast Minnesota sky. To Brandon, they were symbols of a smarter, cleaner future, and he was excited to be a part of building it. His friends and family remember him not as a boisterous personality, but as a deep thinker. He was studious, known for his sharp intellect and a dry wit that would emerge when you least expected it. He was a reader, someone who could lose himself in books for hours, exploring worlds far beyond the cornfields of his home. He was the kind of person you could count on, a steady, reliable presence in the lives of those who knew and loved him. He was a son, a student, a friend. He was a future taking shape. The evening of May 13, 2008 was a threshold. It was a night for celebration, a collective exhale after the pressures of final exams. The spring semester was officially over, and the boundless promise of summer stretched out before Brandon and his friends. They gathered to mark the occasion, a migration of youthful energy moving between parties in the small, tight-knit towns of Lind and Canby. By all accounts, it was a typical end-of-semester celebration for a group of small-town kids. There was music, laughter, and the easy camaraderie of young people on the edge of new beginnings. Friends who were with Brandon that night would later recount the evening's events with a painful forensic precision. They recall that while he had a few drinks over the course of the long evening, he didn't seem dangerously intoxicated. He was in good spirits, relaxed and happy, talking about his plans for the summer and the year ahead. Sometime after midnight, as the parties began to wind down, he said his goodbyes. He climbed into his car, a green 2000 Chevrolet Lumina, for the 30-mile drive back to his parents' home in Marshall. It was a drive he had made countless times, a route etched into his memory. But on this night, the familiar path would lead him somewhere else entirely. The landscape of southwestern Minnesota is a deceptive one. By day, it's a patchwork of orderly fields and farmsteads. But by night, it transforms. The roads that crisscross the counties are a maze of asphalt and gravel, many of them unmarked, cutting through endless fields of corn and soybeans. For a local like Brandon, they are usually as familiar as the back of their own hand. But on this night, something went terribly wrong. At 1:54 a.m., the shrill ring of the telephone sliced through the quiet of the Swanson home. It was Brandon. His mother, Annette, answered, her heart instantly quickening, as any parent's does at a call so late. He was calm, his voice steady, which was a small relief. But his words sent a jolt of concern through his parents. He had driven his car into a ditch and was stuck. He wasn't hurt, he assured them, but he couldn't get the car out. He needed them to come and pick him up. For Brian and Annette Swanson, that late-night call from their son was a moment of parental concern, but it was not yet a moment of panic. Brandon was a sensible young man, and he sounded composed on the phone. The immediate task was simply to find him. Brandon told his parents he believed he was near Lind, a small town not far from Marshall. It made sense. He was coming from that direction. With the phone line open, a fragile electronic lifeline connecting a lost son to his searching parents, Brian and Annette got into their pickup truck and headed out into the cool, damp spring night. They kept Brandon on the line, his voice a comforting, if distant, presence. The darkness of rural Minnesota is absolute. Far from the glow of city lights, the landscape is swallowed by an inky, featureless blackness. As Brian and Annette drove, they stayed on the phone with Brandon, a disembodied voice in the vast, silent night. They asked him to flash his car's headlights, hoping to see a glimmer in the distance. They did the same, their own headlights cutting a lonely path through the darkness, a desperate Morse code that received no reply. Neither could see the other's signal. The minutes stretched on, each one thicker than the last, filled with the static of the phone line and the cold, growing sense of unease. The initial annoyance of a late-night inconvenience was slowly curdling into genuine confusion and fear. Frustration began to creep into the conversation. Brandon, confident in his knowledge of the local roads, insisted he was near Lind. He was a local boy. He knew these roads, but his parents, driving every route he described, back and forth through the area, found no sign of him. His green Lumina wasn't in any of the ditches along the familiar farm roads. The night air was alive with the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of wind through the young cornfields, a sound of serene nature that was a stark, almost cruel, contrast to the rising tension in the voices on the phone. After what felt like an eternity of fruitless searching, with Brian and Annette growing more and more perplexed, Brandon made a decision. He could see the lights of a town in the distance, a faint, hopeful glow in the oppressive darkness. He told his parents he was tired of waiting. He was getting out of the car and was going to start walking towards those lights. The decision for Brandon to leave his car marked a critical turning point in the night's events, a choice made in darkness and frustration that would have unimaginable consequences. With his father, Brian, still on the phone, a constant voice of guidance in his ear, Brandon began his trek through the unseen landscape. He described his surroundings in disjointed fragments, a sensory report from a world his parents couldn't see. He described the crunch and slide of gravel under his feet, indicating he was on a farm road. He mentioned cutting through fields, the silhouette of a fence line against the slightly less black night sky. At one point, he mentioned hearing the sound of running water somewhere nearby, a detail that at the time seemed insignificant, but would later become a focal point of immense, agonizing speculation. He was navigating by pure instinct, his senses his only guide in the disorienting, featureless darkness. He was a young man trying to find his way home, his father's voice the only steady presence in a world that had become strange and hostile. The conversation between father and son continued, a fragile thread of connection stretching across the miles of dark farmland. They were a team, working together to solve this late-night puzzle. They made a plan. They agreed to meet at a local landmark in Lind that they both knew well, the parking lot of a popular nightclub. It was a concrete, tangible goal. Brian continued to drive, his headlights sweeping across empty fields and deserted intersections, while Brandon walked, his voice a constant stream of updates and observations. There was still no discernible panic in his voice, no sense of impending danger. By all accounts, it was a conversation born of a minor mishap, a frustrating inconvenience that would soon be resolved. It would be a story to tell in the morning, a minor drama of youth. But the night had other plans. 47 minutes. That's how long the lifeline between Brandon and his parents remained open. 47 minutes of searching, of talking, of trying to bridge the physical distance that separated them. 47 minutes of a father listening to his son's footsteps on a gravel road. And then, in a single, heart-stopping instant, everything changed. In the middle of a sentence, Brandon's voice was cut short by a sudden, sharp exclamation, a word spat out with surprise or sudden fear. "Oh shit!" And then silence, a heavy, Absolute and terrifying silence that was more horrifying than any sound could ever be. Brian yelled his son's name into the phone. "Brandon? Brandon!" There was nothing. The line was still open, but the other side was dead air. Brian and Aunt Tetha's world tilted on its axis and spun into a nightmare. One moment, they were talking to their son, and the next, he was simply gone. They called his name again and again into the silent phone, their voices cracking with a dawning, sickening horror. There was no response. After a few agonizing moments, they ended the call, their minds racing. What if he tripped and dropped his phone in the tall grass? In the pitch-black night, the illuminated screen of a ringing phone might be his only hope of finding it. They called back immediately, and again, and again. Each ring was a desperate plea, a prayer sent out into the darkness, echoing unanswered across the empty fields of Minnesota. The calls went straight to voicemail. The 47-minute conversation had ended, and with it, all contact with Brandon Swanson was lost forever. As the first faint hints of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in hues of gray and pale pink, the true, gut-wrenching nightmare began for Brian and Annette Swanson. Their son was missing. At 6:30 a.m., their hope exhausted, they did the only thing they could. They reported Brandon's disappearance to the Lind police. The initial response they received was not one of urgency, but of dismissive bureaucracy, a moment that would compound their agony. The officer on duty suggested it wasn't unusual for a 19-year-old man to stay out all night after celebrating the end of the school year. "It's his right to be missing," the officer stated, a phrase that would later become a symbol of the systemic failures they faced. But as the hours bled into one another in Brandon, the responsible son who always checked in did not return. The seriousness of the situation could no longer be ignored. The official search for Brandon Swanson began in earnest, but it was a search plagued from the start by a critical error, based entirely on Brandon's confident assertions that he was near Lind. That's where law enforcement and worried family members focused all their efforts. They scoured the roads and fields, their eyes scanning every ditch and tree line for any sign of the missing young man or his green Lumina. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, a crucial piece of technological evidence emerged that would turn the entire investigation on its head. In a desperate attempt to find a lead, investigators subpoenaed Brandon's cell phone records. The data told a story that completely contradicted Brandon's own perceptions. The signal from his final 47-minute call had not come from a tower near Lind. It had pinged off a cell tower near Taunton, a small town 25 miles away in a completely different direction. He had been disoriented, lost in his own backyard. The discovery of Brandon's true location sent a shockwave through the search teams. They had wasted precious hours looking in the wrong place, miles and miles from where he had actually been. With this new vital information, the entire search operation was uprooted and shifted to the area around Taunton, in neighboring Yellow Medicine County. And there, late in the afternoon, they found it. In a ditch off a lonely gravel road, hidden from the main thoroughfare, sat Brandon's Chevrolet Lumina. The car was high-centered on the edge of the ditch, the wheels unable to get traction. It was undamaged. The doors were unlocked. The keys were missing. Inside, his glasses sat on the dashboard. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no indication of any foul play. It was as if he had simply gotten out of the car, locked the door, and walked away into the night. The discovery of the car transformed the search from a missing person case into a massive boots-on-the-ground operation. The scene itself was an enigma. Lincoln County Sheriff Jack Vizecki arrived at the location, his mind racing. The car was stuck, but not badly. A single person might have struggled, but two men could have likely pushed it out. Nothing about the scene screamed violence or panic. It just looked abandoned. He walked the perimeter, his boots sinking slightly into the soft spring soil. The tall grass around the car was mostly undisturbed, except for a clear path leading away from the driver's side door. It seemed to confirm the story told on the phone. Brandon had gotten out and started walking, but walking where? And what had he met in the darkness? Sheriff Vizecki set up a makeshift command post, the quiet rural intersection suddenly buzzing with the crackle of police radios and the arrival of search teams. Law enforcement from multiple counties joined the effort, a coordinated response to a deepening mystery. Search dogs, the most crucial tool in this kind of vast, open landscape, were brought in. The dogs, a pair of highly trained German shepherds, were given a piece of Brandon's clothing to lock onto his scent. They picked it up immediately at the car's door and followed the trail with an unnerving confidence. The path led away from the road, across a field, and then along a gravel farm lane. It was a trail that seemed to mirror the one he had described to his father on the phone. It led them past an abandoned farmstead, the dilapidated buildings standing like silent, decaying sentinels. And then the trail led them straight to the banks of the Yellow Medicine River. The Yellow Medicine River, in the spring, is not a gentle, meandering stream. Swollen with snowmelt and recent rains, it becomes a formidable force. Its currents are swift and treacherous, and its waters are numbingly cold. The search dogs followed Brandon's scent directly to the river's edge, where they became agitated and confused. The trail simply stopped. The immediate, logical, and most heartbreaking conclusion was that Brandon, walking in the pitch-black darkness, had not seen the river's edge and had fallen in. It was a horrifying theory, but one that seemed to fit the available evidence. The search efforts immediately pivoted, focusing on the river. Boats, divers, and sophisticated sonar equipment were deployed to comb its murky, debris-filled depths. Day after day, they searched, but the river, which had seemed to offer a final tragic answer, yielded nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of Brandon Swanson at all. As the river search continued fruitlessly, another chilling detail emerged from the cell phone records. Brandon's phone had remained active for some time after his disappearance. This new piece of information cast a deep shadow of doubt on the drowning theory. If his phone had been submerged in the river, it would have been rendered inoperable almost immediately. But for several days, calls to his phone from his family and investigators would ring multiple times before going to voicemail, suggesting it was still powered on and functioning. This raised a cascade of disturbing questions. If Brandon wasn't in the river, where was he? Was he incapacitated somewhere? His phone just out of reach? Or was someone else in possession of his phone? The mystery, which had briefly seemed to have a tragic but simple solution, had just become infinitely more complex and sinister. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson left a void that could never be filled, not only in the lives of his family and friends, but in the wider community of Marshall. The initial dismissive response from law enforcement, the painful memory of being told it was their son's right to be missing, highlighted a critical flaw in the system for handling missing persons cases involving adults. In the dark days and months following their son's disappearance, Brian and Annette Swanson channeled their unimaginable grief into a powerful force for change. They became tireless, eloquent advocates, sharing their painful story with lawmakers and the public. They lobbied the Minnesota State Legislature to create a law that would ensure that all missing persons cases, regardless of the person's age, are treated with the urgency and seriousness they deserve from the very first call. We can imagine Annette Swanson standing before a legislative committee at the state capitol in St. Paul. She isn't a politician or a lawyer. She is a mother, her voice steady but laced with a pain that is palpable in the quiet room. She tells them about the 47-minute phone call, about the hours they spent searching in the wrong place, about the dismissive tone of that first officer they spoke to. When your child is missing, she might have said, her eyes meeting those of the lawmakers, your world stops. Every second that passes is an eternity of what-ifs. We believe that the response from law enforcement in those first critical hours should reflect that urgency. An adult has the right to be missing, yes, but their family has the right to know that everything possible is being done to find them from the very first moment they are gone. In 2009, her words and their tireless efforts bore fruit. Brandon's law was passed unanimously. It was a legacy born from an unbearable tragedy, a law that would help countless other families in their darkest hours, ensuring they would not face the same initial hurdles the Swansons did. Years have passed since that cool spring night in 2008. The fields around Taunton have been planted and harvested more than a dozen times over. The waters of the Yellow Medicine River continue their inexorable flow, carrying with them the secrets of that night. The search for Brandon Swanson has never officially ended. For his family, for his friends, for a community of volunteers that continues to this day, the search is a constant state of being. Every year, when the crops are out of the fields, they gather. Farmers on ATVs, neighbors on foot, strangers from across the country who have been touched by his story. They walk the fields, the riverbanks, the abandoned properties, their eyes scanning the ground for a piece of clothing, a bone, anything that might offer a clue, an answer, an end to the not knowing. What remains are the unanswered questions, the theories that swirl around the case like the dust on a lonely gravel road. Was it a tragic accident? Did he, disoriented and perhaps suffering from hypothermia, simply wander into the vast, unforgiving landscape and succumb to the elements? Did he fall into the river at a point further downstream, his body carried away by the strong current? Or did he meet with foul play on that dark and desolate road? Did he stumble upon something he wasn't supposed to see? Was his final cryptic exclamation of, "Oh shit," the sound of someone surprised by a sudden drop, or by the sudden appearance of another person? The mystery of Brandon Swanson's disappearance is a stark, painful reminder of the fragility of life, of how quickly the familiar can become the terrifyingly unknown. It's a story of a family's enduring love and their unwavering, agonizing hope for answers. It is a story of a law that stands as his legacy. But most of all, it is the story of a 47-minute phone call, a conversation that started with a simple request for help and ended with a single question that still hangs, unanswered, in the vast Minnesota night. What happened to Brandon Swanson?